In the cold, sterile archives of the Galactic Consortium, there exists a file on every known sentient species, a meticulous catalog of biology, psychology, and martial potential. For millennia, the entry for humanity was a footnote, a brief and dismissive analysis. It spoke of a species of fragile bipeds from a chaotic, high-gravity death world. It noted our lack of natural armor, our pathetic claws, our blunt teeth. But the most damning assessment, the one universally accepted by elder races like the Cathar, was this: humans were slow predators. The Cathar, a species of crystalline behemoths, built their entire military doctrine on what they called the measured strike. To them, true power was deliberate, inevitable, and slow. A glacier carving a canyon, a star collapsing into a singularity. A Cathar legionary encased in bioorganic armor could take minutes to bring its primary weapon to bear, a singularity projector that would erase a city block. But once that process began, it was absolute. They viewed the frantic, panicked skirmishes of human history as proof of our inferiority. Our wars were a flurry of inefficient motion, a desperate flailing in the dark. They believed we lacked the patience, the discipline, the sheer biological gravitas for true, professional violence. They logged us as possessing a threat response time measured in whole seconds, an eternity in galactic combat. They claimed humans couldn't kill quickly. They built their entire strategy for dominance around this single, fatal assumption. This is the story of the moment that assumption died. This is the story of the diplomatic incident on Bastion Station, of the Cathar Praetor Guard, and of a single human woman who was catalogued as little more than decorative security. This is the story of how they learned that on Earth, evolution had forged its predators not in the patient cold of deep space, but in the frantic, heart-pounding, split-second terror of the savannah and the jungle. This is the story of what happened when they tried to press an alarm and discovered the difference between the speed of electricity and the speed of a human predator unleashed. This is the story of how she cleared the room before that alarm could even sound. To understand the magnitude of their mistake, you must first understand the Cathar. They were not evil, not in the way humanity understands the concept. They were order, they were logic. They were beings of immense size and geological patience. A Cathar could live for 5,000 standard years, its thoughts as slow and ponderous as its movements. Their society was a reflection of their biology, crystalline, structured, and crushingly powerful. Their bodies, silicon-based and faceted, were incredibly resilient. A standard plasma bolt would simply refract off their hide, creating a dazzling but harmless light show. To injure a Cathar, you needed sustained, high-intensity energy or a kinetic force equivalent to an artillery shell. Their philosophy of conflict, the measured strike, was born from this biology. Why waste energy on a quick, risky jab when a slow, unstoppable push would achieve the same result with absolute certainty? Their starships didn't engage in dogfights. They moved into orbital positions over weeks, calculated firing solutions for days, and then unleashed gravitational weapons that would warp spacetime itself. Their ground troops didn't charge. They advanced in perfect, implacable lines, weathering enemy fire as a cliff face weathers the sea, until they were in position to deploy their own devastating, slow-acting weaponry. When they first encountered humanity, their xenobiologists and military strategists were amused. They watched our historical records, our frantic wars fought with chemical propellants and crude explosives. They saw our soldiers, soft-skinned and panicked, diving for cover, shouting, bleeding. It looked like chaos. It looked weak. They measured the reaction time of an average human soldier at just under a second. They measured the swing of a human fist, the pull of a trigger. All of it confirmed their bias: slow, inefficient, prone to panic. Their analysis of our biology was even more dismissive. They noted the constant, frantic beating of our hearts, a wasteful expenditure of energy. They noted our adrenal system, a panic response that flooded the body with chemicals, degrading fine motor control and logical thought. To the Cathar, adrenaline was a biological flaw, a bug in the system that caused an organism to thrash uselessly in its death throes. They saw a species that had evolved to run, to hide, to throw things from a distance. A prey animal that had stumbled into tool use. So when the Terran Confederacy sent a diplomatic envoy to Bastion Station to petition for probationary membership in the Galactic Consortium, the Cathar, who held veto power, saw it as a formality before a quiet refusal. The human delegation was small. Ambassador Thorne, a seasoned diplomat, his aide, and a single security officer. The Cathar praetor, Xyler, insisted on this arrangement. A display of trust, he had communicated, a sentiment dripping with condescension. The truth was, he wanted the humans to feel small, insignificant, and utterly at the mercy of their hosts. The security officer was, to him, the most amusing part of the farce. A single, small-statured human female. What could she possibly do against his 8 elite Praetorium guards, each one a walking mountain of crystalline armor and restrained power? The woman's name was Evelyn. In the Terran Confederacy's official records, she was designated Specialist Anya Sharma, Diplomatic Security Division. But her true file was buried so deep it was practically mythical. Her designation was Subject 734, the last surviving graduate of the Chimera program. Chimera wasn't about creating super soldiers in the way the Cathar would understand. It wasn't about grafting on armor or building bigger muscles. The architects of Chimera had understood a fundamental, brutal truth about human evolution. Humanity didn't survive because it was the strongest or the toughest. It survived because, in a crisis, it could become the fastest. The program wasn't about rewriting DNA. It was about unlocking what was already there. It was about weaponizing the fight-or-flight response that the Cathar so deeply misunderstood. They took individuals with a rare genetic marker, one that governed the production of acetylcholinesterase, the enzyme that breaks down neurotransmitters in the synaptic gap. They tweaked it. They didn't just want a subject who could react quickly. They wanted a subject whose mind could process information so rapidly that the world itself appeared to slow down. They didn't enhance the adrenal system, they refined it. In a normal human, a surge of adrenaline is a panicked, messy explosion of energy. In Evelyn, it was a controlled, cold fusion reaction. Her heart rate could triple in a nanosecond, but instead of panic, it brought about a state of hyperperception. Her brain, flooded with perfectly processed neurochemicals, wouldn't see chaos. It would see a clockwork universe, every moving part tracked, every trajectory calculated. They called this state the spark within. It wasn't just about moving fast. It was about thinking fast. It was the ability to observe, orient, decide, and act, the OODA loop, while your opponent was still on the first O. The cost was immense. The metabolic price of entering this state could kill a normal human. Evelyn could only sustain it for seconds at a time, and it left her utterly drained. But in those few seconds, she was not bound by the same temporal reality as everyone else. She stood behind Ambassador Thorne in the praetor's grand chamber on Bastion Station. The room was vast, cold, and imposing, carved from the living obsidian of the asteroid it was built on. The air was thin, chilled to Cathar preferences. Evelyn wore the simple, dark blue uniform of the diplomatic corps. A single sidearm was holstered at her hip, a kinetic pulse pistol that the Cathar had insisted on scanning and logging. It was little more than a pea shooter against their armor. It was a prop. She was a prop, and she knew it. Praetor Xyler sat on a throne-like dais, flanked by 2 of his guards. 6 more were positioned around the room. They stood perfectly still, their faceted heads catching the dim light. They looked like statues, dangerous, arrogant statues. Ambassador Thorne, Xyler's voice was a low-frequency rumble that vibrated in Evelyn's bones. We have reviewed your species' petition. We have analyzed your history, your biology, your potential. The pause was deliberate, insulting. You are a young species, volatile, prone to emotion and wasteful conflict. Your request to join the consortium is premature. Ambassador Thorne kept his composure. Praetor, humanity has achieved interstellar travel. We have established stable colonies, and we have abided by every tenet of first contact law. We have proven ourselves capable of galactic citizenship. Xyler made a gesture with a three-fingered hand, a slow, dismissive wave. You have proven you are clever apes who have harnessed fire, nothing more. Your biology betrays you. You are soft. You are panicked. Your greatest weapon is desperation, and desperation has no place in an orderly galaxy. The test was coming. Evelyn could feel it, the subtle shift in the guard's posture. The way Xyler's gaze lingered on Thorne, not as a diplomat, but as a specimen. To that end, the praetor rumbled, we have decided the Terran Confederacy requires a period of observation, a tutelage. You and your staff will remain here on Bastion as our guests. We will guide your people, help you curb your more chaotic impulses. It was a declaration of imprisonment, a power play. In that moment, Thorne's diplomatic mission had failed. He glanced back, a flicker of fear in his eyes, not for himself, but for what this meant for humanity. A subordinate race, a protectorate under the thumb of the arrogant Cathar. Praetor, this is a violation of all galactic protocols, Thorne said, his voice tight. I must strongly object. Your objections are noted, Xyler said, his voice devoid of interest. Guards, escort our guests to their new quarters, confine them. And that was the signal. The Cathar believed in the measured strike. Their movements were deliberate. The two guards beside the throne took a slow, synchronized step forward. The 6 guards around the room turned, their heavy footfalls echoing in the chamber. One of them, positioned near the main door, reached a thick, crystalline finger toward a large, glowing red panel on the wall. This was the containment alarm. It would seal the room with a 10-meter-thick blast door and flood the chamber with a soporific gas designed for large, slow-breathing organisms. Once that alarm was pressed, the encounter was over. The Cathar guard's finger was 10 centimeters from the panel. The electrical impulse from its brain to its hand, traveling through its silicon-based neurology, was slow and certain. It had all the time in the universe. In its perception, the small human female was still standing perfectly still, a statue of obsolete flesh and bone. But Evelyn was no longer there. For her, the world had changed. The praetor's final word, confine, was the trigger. In the space between one of her heartbeats and the next, the spark within ignited. The rumble of Xyler's voice faded into a low, meaningless drone. The slow, heavy footsteps of the guards became the grinding of tectonic plates, events happening on a geological timescale. The air itself seemed to thicken, to resist her, but it was an illusion. It was her mind that had accelerated, breaking free from the sluggish prison of normal time. She didn't see 8 Cathar guards. She saw a system of levers, fulcrums, and stress points. She saw 8 fragile, complex machines. Her brain, operating at 1,000 times its normal speed, painted the room in lines of probability. The guard by the door, threat priority 1, its finger was moving. To her perception, it was a snail crawling across a vast, red desert. The distance to the alarm panel was an eternity she would not grant it. Her hand didn't go to her pistol. That was the prop. That was the misdirection. Her left hand blurred, unsnapping a small, weighted cylinder from the small of her back, hidden by her uniform jacket. It wasn't a weapon. It was a tool, a high-density, grav-stabilized counterweight. Her first movement was not an attack. It was a step. A single, perfect, explosive step, powered by leg muscles contracting in perfect sequence. The floor tiles were a launch pad. She crossed the 5 meters to the nearest guard on her right in a time frame so short it couldn't be properly measured. The Cathar was turning, its massive head swiveling with ponderous grace. It never saw her. Evelyn didn't attack its armored torso or its thick limbs. Her analysis, born of studying Cathar anatomy from smuggled autopsy reports, had identified a critical weakness. Where the faceted plates of their neck met the upper torso, there was a convergence of neural pathways and nutrient conduits. A nexus, protected by overlapping armor but with a seam. A seam you could only exploit if you knew exactly where it was, and if you could apply precise, incredible force to that single point. Her right hand, fingers rigid, formed a spear. She didn't punch. She drove. Her entire body, all her forward momentum, channeled into that single point. The crack was not loud. It was a dry, definitive snap like old wood breaking. The guard's internal lights flickered and died. It stood there for a full second, a dead statue, before its knees buckled and it began its slow, inevitable collapse to the floor. She was already moving. Before the first guard's body had even registered its own death, she had recoiled off its armored shell, using it as a backboard to launch herself across the room toward threat priority 1, the guard by the alarm. In her hyperperceptive state, she saw the electrical field shimmering around the alarm panel. She saw the microscopic tremor in the guard's finger as the final nerve signal arrived. She had less than 1/100th of a second. She threw the weighted cylinder. It wasn't aimed at the guard. It was aimed at the wall just above the alarm panel. It struck the obsidian with a sharp crack and ricocheted down at a perfect, calculated angle. It hit the guard's hand not with the force of a weapon, but with the precise, disruptive energy of a surgeon's hammer. The impact shattered the delicate crystalline finger structure. The slow, deliberate press became a spasm of agony. The hand recoiled. The alarm was denied. The circuit remained open. 2 guards down, 6 to go. Ambassador Thorne had only just begun to register the first guard's collapse, his own mind struggling to catch up. He saw a blur of blue. The 2 guards who had been flanking the praetor's throne were now moving, their training finally kicking in. But their training was for fighting soldiers, for plasma fire and explosions. Not for this, not for a ghost. Evelyn landed from her crossroom maneuver in a crouch. The guard who had recoiled from the alarm panel was now her shield. The other guards couldn't get a clear shot, assuming they could even track her. She drove her elbow back into the wounded guard's leg joint, a spot where the armor was thinner to allow for movement. The joint shattered. As the giant fell, she used its momentum, vaulting over its collapsing form. She now had her pistol in her hand. The Cathar saw it and almost relaxed. A pea shooter, pathetic. They didn't understand its purpose. She wasn't aiming for their armor. She fired twice. Pop, pop. The sound was insignificant in the vast chamber. The kinetic pulses were not meant to penetrate. They were meant to distract. The first pulse hit the faceted face of a guard to her left. It did no damage, but the flash of light and the impact, right next to its primary optical sensor, was disorienting. A bright, blinding starburst in its vision. The second pulse hit the floor at the feet of another guard, kicking up a spray of obsidian dust and forcing an instinctual flinch. These were not attacks. They were inputs. She was feeding the system false data, creating momentary confusion, tiny windows of opportunity that only she was fast enough to exploit. While two guards were disoriented, she closed the distance on a third. This one was raising its weapon, a heavy plasma caster. It was a slow process. To her, the barrel was rising with the speed of a growing flower. She slid under the rising weapon, her hand grabbing the thick power cable that ran from the weapon's power pack on the guard's back. She didn't pull it out. She braced her feet and yanked, using her entire body weight as a lever. The guard was a mountain, but physics is a universal law. Its center of gravity was high. The yank, applied at the perfect angle, destabilized it. The giant stumbled, its own immense weight becoming its enemy. It staggered sideways, crashing into the guard she had just blinded with the kinetic pulse. Two massive crystalline bodies collided with a grinding crunch. Two more threats temporarily neutralized. 3 guards remaining, the 2 from the throne and 1 other near the center of the room. They were finally beginning to process the reality of the situation. This was not a panicked human. This was something else, something they had no protocol for. One of the throne guards abandoned its measured strike philosophy and charged. It was a desperate, clumsy move for a Cathar. It lowered its head, intending to simply run her down, to crush her under its bulk. Evelyn stood her ground. To Ambassador Thorne, it looked like suicide. To Praetor Xyler, who was now rising from his throne, a look of utter disbelief on his face, it looked like the inevitable conclusion. The small mammal would be smeared across the floor. But Evelyn saw the geometry. She saw the charge not as a threat, but as a delivery system. A massive amount of kinetic energy delivered directly to her. All she had to do was redirect it. At the last possible microsecond, she dropped, her body going slick and low. The charging Cathar thundered over her. As it passed, she drove her rigid hand up into its underbelly. Again, not a feat of strength. It was precision. She struck a diagnostic port, a small, recessed panel that maintenance drones used to interface with the guard's biosystems. Her fingers, strong and practiced, tore the panel loose. She didn't need to do anything else. The sudden depressurization of its internal systems and the short-circuiting of the exposed port did the work for her. The charging guard shuddered, its systems failing catastrophically. It skidded for another 10 meters before crashing, inert, into the far wall. 5 down. The entire sequence from her first step to the fall of the 5th guard had taken 2.8 seconds. The last 2 guards and the praetor himself were all that remained. They stood frozen, not by fear, but by sheer, processing-shattering disbelief. They were trying to reconcile what their optical sensors were showing them with 1,000 years of established Cathar doctrine. It was like watching a rock fall upwards. It was impossible. Evelyn didn't give them time to reconcile anything. She was flowing, a river of motion. She snatched the heavy plasma caster from the guard she had destabilized earlier. It was heavy, designed for a Cathar, but she didn't try to aim it. She simply turned it on the 2 guards who were still tangled up and pulled the trigger. The weapon, not designed for such close quarters, unleashed a torrent of uncontrolled, superheated plasma. The 2 entangled guards, unable to move, were caught in the blast. Their crystalline armor, designed to deflect focused shots, began to melt and slag under the sustained, point-blank inferno. 2.8 seconds. 7 guards neutralized. Only Praetor Xyler remained. He stood by his throne, his mind a maelstrom of confusion. He had seen his elite, his invincible Praetorium Guard, dismantled in less time than it took for him to form a coherent thought. Evelyn stood in the center of the room, the borrowed plasma caster humming in her hands. She was breathing heavily, the first signs of the metabolic cost of the spark beginning to set in. Her time was running out. She let the heavy weapon clatter to the floor. She didn't need it. She looked at Xyler. Her eyes, which a moment ago had been wide with hyperperception, were now cold, focused, and utterly human. The praetor looked from her to his fallen guards, to the untouched alarm panel on the wall. The glowing red light was a beacon of his failure. It was a monument to his arrogance. The alarm, designed to signal the containment of a threat, had not been triggered because the threat moved faster than the signal itself. In the silence of the chamber, broken only by the hum of failing Cathar technology and the ragged sound of Evelyn's breathing, Ambassador Thorne finally found his voice. It was quiet, shaky, but clear. "Praetor Xyler," he said, stepping forward to stand beside Evelyn. "I believe you have fundamentally miscalculated our species' potential for wasteful conflict." The aftermath was a silent storm that ripped through the Galactic consortium. The Cathar, in a desperate bid to save face, tried to bury the incident. They claimed a catastrophic systems malfunction in their guards' cybernetics. But they couldn't erase the internal sensor logs from the chamber. They couldn't erase the testimony of a stunned Ambassador Thorne, and they couldn't erase the new data point they now possessed. When they analyzed the logs, slowing them down to the millisecond frame, their disbelief turned to a cold, primal fear they hadn't felt in millennia. They saw it. They saw the blur. They saw a single organism execute dozens of complex, interconnected actions in the time it took their own elite soldiers to take a single step. They saw her exploit weaknesses they didn't even know existed. They saw her weaponize their own arrogance against them. The most chilling revelation came from their xenobiologists. They reanalyzed the human adrenal system. They had called it a panic response. They were wrong. It wasn't a bug, it was a feature, a predator's feature. It was a biological overclocking mechanism forged in an evolutionary crucible where the difference between life and death was measured in the beat of a hummingbird's wing. On Earth, predators and prey were locked in a constant, high-speed arms race. The cheetah and the gazelle. The hawk and the snake. Speed was life. Hesitation was death. Humanity, the ultimate persistence hunter, the ultimate tool user, had internalized that brutal lesson in its very DNA. The spark within was not an anomaly. It was the ancestral birthright of a species born from desperation and baptized in high-velocity violence. The Cathar had made the biggest mistake in their long history. They had looked at a shark and, seeing no legs, declared it unable to travel. They had judged a predator by the standards of a glacier. Their fatal assumption was not just a military error, it was a philosophical one. They believed power was mass and deliberate force. They learned in 2.8 brutal seconds that true power can also be velocity, precision, and the terrifying efficiency of a creature that has evolved to kill in the blink of an eye. The story of Evelyn, specialist Anya Sharma, became a legend whispered in the halls of power across the galaxy. She was the ghost who moved faster than alarms. She was the brutal truth that shattered an empire's confidence. Her actions didn't just save a diplomatic mission, they rewrote the book on humanity. We were no longer seen as clever, panicked apes. We were seen as a species with a hidden gear, a terrifying potential for violence held in reserve, waiting for the right catalyst. And this is the core of that brutal truth, the lesson carved into the obsidian walls of that chamber on Bastion Station. Your potential is not defined by the metrics of those who would judge you. Your greatest strengths may be hidden in the very things they call your weaknesses. They may call your passion chaos. They may call your speed panic. They may call your resilience desperation. They will build their assumptions on a flawed understanding of who you are, where you came from, and what you have survived. Like the Cathar, the world will try to put you in a box, to label you based on its own slow, ponderous, and limited perception. It will underestimate you. It will assume you are bound by the same speed limits, the same rules of engagement. Your task is not to convince them they are wrong. Your task is to cultivate your own spark within. It is to understand the crucible that forged you. Every challenge, every failure, every moment of desperation was not a weakness. It was a training ground. It was evolution, honing your instincts, sharpening your mind, preparing you for the moment when you will need to move while the world is standing still. Stop waiting for permission. Stop waiting for validation from those who cannot comprehend your speed. Master your own adrenal response. Turn your panic into focus. Turn your desperation into fuel. Learn to see the world not as a series of insurmountable obstacles, but as a system of levers and fulcrums, of opportunities waiting for a precise, decisive action. The moment will come when the alarms are about to be sounded, when the walls are about to close in, when the world has decided to confine you based on its arrogant assumptions. In that moment, you will not have time for a measured strike. You will have a heartbeat. A single, frantic, beautiful heartbeat, and in that space you will have to do the work. You will have to clear the room. Prove them wrong not with words, but with actions so swift and so total that by the time they look at the wreckage, they will question the very laws of reality they thought they understood. That is your potential. That is the spark you carry from an unbroken line of ancestors who survived because they were fast, because they were smart, and because they never, ever let a predator with all the time in the world get the final say. Now go and be ready for your moment. The alarm is about to be pressed. What are you going to do?